society functions on the basis of certain agreed norms, and these in turn are premised on the typical default actions of the majority of humans. When your wiring leads you to do something other than this default in a given situation, you stick out as odd. If your difference ends up being otherwise valuable to that same society, then happy days, you're special, you're a star. Otherwise, you are a problem. ADHD sets you up for being different, but the other surrounding contexts besides your ADHD will decide whether you are the most beloved or the most hated person of your environment. Let's talk about it. So, in early childhood, say ages 0 to 5, a lot of the game of existence comes down to developing reflexes. The brain is writing if this, then that codes based on what happens to happen from moment to moment, based on what's coming in and what the body responds. So, incoming stimuli X, let's say, is met with bodily response Y. And if everything continues fine homeostasis wise, then Y is now the default recorded response for X. That's a new reflex. Society looks around at all the humans doing Y in response to X situation and says, all right, cool. That's the normal human thing to do, is to take in X from this type of context and respond with Y. And in a way, they are correct, because if the vast majority of young human brains would indeed Y as their first and thereafter default reaction or response to X, then that is the normal thing to do in the sense of probabilistically likely for a member of the species. But the fact that it is what typically happens for the species doesn't itself say anything about the quality of Y as a response to X. X is not the only thing you could take in from the environment in that context. Y is not the only possible response to X. Y is not even the best response to X. It's just one that a human brain with a typical set of genetically coded biochemical options available to it and, developing in a typical early childhood situation would experience and would first give as a response to that experience. But when your genetic code means that you have more responses than usual available to you, more biochemical options available to you in response to what your brain and body take in, and what your brain and body are taking in are themselves are atypical because you're growing up in an atypical environment. Maybe yours is louder, chemically spicier, emptier, more painful than usual. Whatever about it is strange, the stage is set for your encoded reflexes to be less if X then Y and more if X22 or X45 or X13 then P. And everyone around you is like, what are you doing? And you want to say to them, I'm doing the same thing you are. The first thing I thought to do, the thing that seemed right to do, the thing my body automatically did. It just so happens to be so different to what yours chose to do. And now, the truly funny part of this experience is that if, on account of the other facts about you, society has agreed that you're supposed to be special, you're supposed to be different, so that it is okay that you are in fact different, then the fact that your life is typified by, X72 equals P experiences and behaviors instead of X equals Y experiences and behaviors will be a good thing. It'll be a great thing. Society will use you to enjoy and marvel at how excitingly different humans can be, how infinite the range of possible experiences and behaviors actually are. You will be an object that proves divinity, that proves transcendence by showing with your very existence and with every move you make that there are infinite ways to move on the game board of the universe. You will show that the defaults are not immutable laws of the universe, that they are biology preferred happen to be's of the universe. When you're the society's darling kind of ADHD, the consequences of your variant experiences or divergent experiences and your behavior are proof of your divinity or proof of your genius to the non religious. Even that which cannot be construed or can't be explained as art in any way or as a product of genius, like not responding to the X of time passing or the substrate of whatever time is accumulating, I guess, with the Y of subconscious counting and awareness of that time passing, instead responding to the X15 of a gap between now and a future event coming up, with the P of ideas of things to do with this space between now and a future event coming up. This, the behavioral outcome of this situation, the time blindness, the chronic lateness that results from this, which obviously cannot be considered an art or a product or object of genius, this would still be judged as proof of that specialness that also gives rise to the genius and to, the art. So you hear things like, of course he's late, his head is too full of genius to be keeping track of time. Maybe someone is saying that about Richard Branson right this minute, for instance. So ADHD and something society has already deemed proof of specialness, extreme beauty, extreme wealth, lightning fast information processing capability applied to something that the economy values, equals a star, come down to earth to walk among mere mortals. But ADHD without these traits, or worse, ADHD with a trait that society has deemed proof of wrongness or badness or not belonging, that's a recipe for provoking ire and anger and punishment with every breath you take and every move you make. Because without your get out of jail free rubber stamp of specialness, then you essentially do the same thing autistic people do by flouting the expectations of the person in front of you and freaking them out accordingly. Like, this other person knows as well as anybody else does that the normal human thing to do in this X type of situation is Y. And yet here you both stand and you're doing P? What even is that? What is wrong with you? Etc., etc. Indeed, you might piss them off even more than an autistic person would in that context, right? Because an autistic person, in having, kind of no sensory access to take in X in the first place, is likely okay, let me try this another way. An autistic person basically having no meaningful access to sensing the X in the first place that would have any hope then of resulting in a Y type behavior is just playing like a totally random game of life in some ways. And so they might serve up an A, like an rather. That's an A with the umlaut, the two dots on top. And the other person, is so thrown by this response that they're just merely confused. Whereas a P in comparison, this analogy is premised in the English language, of course, a P is not that far off from a Y. And so one might think that you purposely went out of your way to not do Y, the normal thing, just so you could do P instead, in order to get the perverse satisfaction of freaking them out or making them feel stupid for doing Y in the first place. And so now it's your problem to manage whatever emotional reaction they usually reserve for people trying to freak them out or trying to make them feel stupid. And so that's loads of fun. Anyway, the other thing that comes with the ADHD experience of life is becoming extraordinarily good at pattern matching. Or recognizing the connection between any two or three or multiple things, no matter how seemingly disparate or far apart that they might be. Maybe you don't get autistic level good, but yeah, pretty good actually, because you spend almost as much time in early childhood sort of mentally trying to work backwards from the situation that has happened, from the being yelled at or the being scolded or the getting in trouble, try to work backwards from how this happened to what must have been going on in your head that led to your actions, what must have been going on in their head that led to their expectations, and you eventually try to figure out how to explain to the other person how you have ended up where you are. And as you do this over and over again, you'll start to be able to see the links between the X of their starting point or their expectation and the X47 of your starting point or your experience and the Y of their response or their expected response from you as compared to the P of your actual behavior. And over time, this whole thing of working backwards and joining the dots between what must have been going on in their head and what was going on in your head and your different behaviors, this becomes your most used mental tool until it's kind of always on and always running by default. And therefore, you're always seeing the links between all sorts of things, maybe eventually everything. And it becomes instinctual. And the other part of this is that you'll also develop a massive kink for it. Because after all, every time in childhood that you were able to grasp the thread of how things were connected in such a way as to explain how the confusion arose around you, it would have been your saving grace. And so that sense of relief at being able to see the connection between things and find the connection and the explanation of that becomes encoded too. And it eventually builds until finding the link between any two or more different things becomes euphoric. It's why ADHD people tend to have such fun friendships with autistic people, because the latter will keep offering up the strangest combinations of ideas possible, since they are mentally charting their own course entirely. And so the ADHDer gets to be stimulated to the point of adrenalized flow state by playing their favorite game of matchy match, these seemingly random topics coming out of this person's mouth, together, and the autistic gets to be listened to and decoded and understood in ways that neurotypical, company rarely, if ever, affords. The only snafu, though, is when the autistic, having stumbled onto, for instance, their favorite subject, wants to go deep down one lane rather than playing the, jumping from subject to subject random matchy game. And then the ADHDer sort of stops getting the chemical stimulation of novel combinations and has to instead power the immensely difficult executive function of active listening with only a principled commitment to being a good listener. And so this seems like a good time to try and explain the chemical situation overall a bit. Because you'll likely have heard a lot about neurotransmitters like dopamine, maybe a little bit about serotonin as well, and you probably also have heard about hormones like estrogen too, and the like, etc. I wager anyway. And so you might find yourself wondering, well, which of these pesky chemicals is responsible for this mess? And, is it a case of too much of it or is it a case of too little of it? But this is a misunderstanding of how brain and body chemicals are and how they work. So let's put them aside for a moment and let's strengthen our ability to grasp them by considering something else, by considering light. So we know that red and yellow and purple, etc., are technically different things. But we also know that in reality, it's just particles of light moving at different speeds, that when the shape of motion of that particle of light is one way, because the environment surrounding the photon is pulling it to move like that, it will render as red to an observer that is set up to pick up color, or yellow, or purple, or whatever, as the case may be. And now if we go back then with this understanding to our brain and body chemicals and consider them as different wavelengths of the same thing, we start to get somewhere, hopefully. So attention or concentration, conscious awareness, fuel, whatever you want to call this thing, in one given shape of motion, on account of how the surrounding environment is pulling on it, it will be dopamine. In another, it's adrenaline. In another, it's serotonin, etc. So when we say that the ADHDer is experiencing X74 instead of X and is responding P instead of Y, included in that is the fact that a particular given signature of chemical motion is happening in the brain and body. So if a neurotypical chemical output when receiving X signal from the world around would be a shape of motion corresponding to X amount of dopamine, and then thereafter that X amount of dopamine went into that typical Y response, then the ADHD situation can be similarly summarized as, the chemical aftermath of taking an X74 from the world around, and that resulting in a certain amount of dopamine and maybe a certain amount of adrenaline, and then it is this certain amount of dopamine and certain amount of adrenaline that will go into that response P. So obviously X stimuli triggering X amount of dopamine resulting in Y outcome, and X74 stimuli triggering X74 amounts of dopamine and adrenaline resulting in P outcome are different situations. And those differences are harder to understand in full if we only consider the chemical representation. I think basically a good shorthand for the whole neurotransmitter, hormone, brain and body chemicals thing is to think of a spectrum going from 1 to 15, with each number being a different color and speed of particles in motion. 1 being the slowest, 15 being the fastest. Now anything moving at the speed of 1 or 2 is so slow it's almost inert, like a crystal or even dust, atoms in such tight formations that they're solid and cold, approaching absolute 0 degrees. And then with the 13s, 14s, and 15s, we're talking high volatility gas particles moving at such speeds, they explode against each other. And then in the middle, you have your liquids, your oils, your serums, particles that are hot and active enough to move, but not too fast and not too energetically. And with that shorthand in mind, consider serotonin crystals and estrogen dusts at that colder end of the spectrum, and your adrenaline and substance P, pain signaler, at the hotter, more volatile, gaseous end of the spectrum, and then your dopamines and your norepinephrines, etc., as your middle of the road, serumy, liquidy, medium excitatory fuel, a 7.5 to like a 9 out of the 15. So when what you take in is different and your range of possible responses is different, such that your behavioral outcome is different, this will reflect in how the chemical soup of your blood plasma is looking. But that's just neither the whole story nor even the best place to look for a coherent explanation of what's going on. And now, of course, playing around with the composition of your chemical soup will affect what you take in and how you respond, and can make it easier to take in X instead of X74 from the world around you, and to pull off a Y response instead of the P that you would have done by your own default. So this caveat that the chemicals don't do the best job of explaining the situation in human-friendly terms is not any sort of rejection of medication. Hack that soup if you need to. Just understand that you're doing so in order to make it easier to flow on the same wavelength as most of society. And sometimes that may be for the best, but there's nothing wrong with taking in more of the world than typically possible, or having a broader range of response options because of your genetic code and the inflammatory context of your early childhood. And when you adapt to society's expectations, let it come from the perspective of making your experience of life as peaceful and joyful as possible, not from the perspective of there being something wrong with you. Finally then, for my case, and for all the other ADHDers, autism plus ADHD out there, I will say that yes, it is a most challenging set of experience or set of circumstances to combine the autistic lack of a resonance-based map in the first place with the ADHD situation of learning from your environment, but taking in different inputs than what would typically happen in that situation, and then having a different chemical reaction and then a different bodily reaction thereafter, such that you won't just say the strangest possible thing from the other person's perspective. You'll also say it maybe too loudly or too quickly, because the chemical excitement in your body at the prospect of speaking is so high, because that's what happened to get encoded in your early childhood when your defaults were being set up. That said, you can end up in a beautiful sweet spot where your autistic needs and your ADHD tendencies wonderfully balance each other out, like autistically finding such safety in routine, since it lets you avoid turning on the overburdened and constantly overheating thinking machine, such that you want to build routine enough to actually follow through and do so, which is ideal because routine is the ultimate antidote to ADHD traits like time-blindness and poor short-term memory and wildly varying moods and motivation, etc. And then at the same time, you might ADHD-ishly enjoy novelty enough to be able to avoid the typical autistic pitfall of freaking out when your routines are disrupted, because you can ADHD-ishly just pursue novelty and do something else instead. So anyway, that's ADHD in a nutshell for you. Have a nice day.